Britain motorized its police in the 1930s. Some cars could chase a bank robber across county lines. Some couldn't outrun a bicycle. Stay for number 1. It was never unreliable or unpopular. It just couldn't go fast enough to catch anything. Subscribe and stick around, because you won't want to miss it. This is the countdown. Number 10, Standard 9, 1933. The car bought because it was the cheapest thing on the price list, not because anyone thought it through. The Standard 9, and its Flying 9 successor, was adopted by several smaller county forces in the early 1930s as a basic runabout for beat sergeants and rural constables covering wide, thinly populated patches. Its 1.0-liter side-valve engine produced around 23 brake horsepower. Contemporary road tests recorded a top speed of around 55 miles per hour. The 9 was inexpensive to buy and cheap to run, which mattered enormously to watch committees still deciding whether motorizing the police was worth the ratepayers' money at all, at a time when every capital expenditure had to be justified line by line to councillors who had never approved anything like it before. Standard Sales Department understood exactly who it was selling to, and its literature for the 9 leaned heavily on running cost figures rather than performance claims, a deliberate pitch to committees more worried about petrol bills than pursuit speeds. The unexpected fact, several forces that bought the 9 in bulk found themselves replacing clutches and gearboxes within the first 18 months of service, the car's economy engineering simply not built for the constant stop-start mileage that beat patrol actually demanded, mileage closer to a delivery van's daily routine than the leisurely weekend motoring the 9 had originally been designed around. A car chosen to save money ended up costing several forces more in workshop bills than a slightly better vehicle would have in the first place, a lesson more than one watch committee had to relearn more than once before the decade was out. Number 9, Austin 12, 1931. Solid, respectable, and about as exciting as the committee meeting that ordered it. The Austin 12 became one of the most common general duty saloons in British policing through the early and mid-1930s, valued for its unremarkable, easily maintained mechanicals over anything resembling outright pace. Its 1.9-liter side-valve engine produced around 24 brake horsepower. Contemporary road tests recorded a top speed of around 55 miles per hour. The 12 was, by the standards of the day, a genuinely dependable car, and its widespread availability meant parts and trained mechanics were rarely hard to find, a real advantage for forces without dedicated motor workshops of their own, who often relied on the nearest Austin dealer for anything more than routine servicing. Austin's existing relationships with municipal fleets, built through years of supplying taxis and commercial vehicles to British towns, gave the 12 an easy route into police service that newer or smaller manufacturers simply could not match. The unexpected fact, the 12's touring car origins meant it had never been engineered with any particular urgency in mind, and several serving officers of the period are on record describing it as adequate for getting to an incident and entirely unsuited to doing anything useful once there, a reputation that followed the car through most of its service life. In our view, the 12 was the automotive equivalent of a constable who always turned up, eventually, and never once in time, which is precisely the kind of dependable mediocrity a stretched 1930s budget could most easily live with. Number 8, Morris Oxford, 1933. Britain's other default saloon, chosen for largely the same unglamorous reasons. The Morris Oxford Series 2 served alongside the Austin 12 as one of the 2 default general-purpose patrol saloons used by urban and county forces through the decade, the 2 cars effectively splitting the entire mid-market police fleet between them. Its 1.8-liter side-valve engine produced around 29 brake horsepower. Contemporary road tests recorded a top speed of around 58 miles per hour. The Oxford offered slightly more performance than its Austin rival and a marginally more comfortable ride, which made it the preferred choice among forces that had the luxury of choosing between the 2 rather than simply taking whatever discount was offered that quarter. William Morris's own reputation for aggressive headline-grabbing price cuts across his entire range meant the Oxford's fleet pricing could shift considerably from one year's order to the next, sometimes undercutting Austin outright and sometimes not, depending on decisions made in Cowley that had nothing to do with policing at all. The unexpected fact, Morris and Austin dealers competed so aggressively for police fleet contracts in this period that several forces are recorded switching their entire standard saloon order between the 2 makers more than once across the decade, chasing discounts rather than any meaningful difference in capability between the 2 nearly identical cars. The Oxford was a car bought and rebought based on which showroom blinked first, which is a strange way to build a fleet meant to keep the public safe, and a stranger habit still for the taxpayers ultimately footing the bill each time. Number 7, Riley 9, 1934. A genuinely sporting little car, undone by exactly the fragility that made it sporting in the first place. A small number of forces, drawn by the Riley 9's reputation on the racing circuit, trialed the car for faster response and pursuit work in the mid-1930s, hoping a genuinely competitive small car might close the gap with the larger, more expensive pursuit vehicles other forces were beginning to operate. Its 1.1-liter twin-camshaft engine produced around 34 brake horsepower. Contemporary road tests recorded a top speed of around 70 miles per hour, genuinely brisk for a car of this size and era, and considerably faster than either of the two saloons immediately above it on this list. The 9's high-revving engine and light chassis gave it real pace on open roads, and its competition pedigree, built on genuine success at circuits like Brooklands, made it an attractive proposition on paper for forces wanting something faster than the standard saloon fleet without stretching to a full sporting tourer. The unexpected fact, the 9's twin-camshaft engine, so effective on a racetrack with a dedicated mechanic on hand between every outing, proved temperamental and expensive to maintain under the harder, less forgiving conditions of everyday police mileage, and at least one force is recorded quietly returning its cars to standard saloons within 2 years, the enthusiasm of the original purchase decision having quietly evaporated somewhere in the workshop. A car built to win races was asked to do a very different job, and the racetrack thinking that made it fast on a Sunday afternoon made it a liability on a Tuesday night shift, when there was no pit crew waiting and no second car to switch into. Before we go further, it's worth pausing on what these first 4 entries share. The Standard, the Austin, the Morris, and the Riley were all bought by forces working within tight, closely scrutinized budgets, and every one of those purchases reflects a compromise made somewhere between a chief constable's operational wish list and a treasurer's actual balance sheet. None of these were bad cars in isolation. What made them disappointing, in a policing context, was the gap between what they were asked to do and what they had ever been engineered for. That gap only widens from here, as the cars get faster, more expensive, and considerably harder to justify to a watch committee still counting every shilling. Number 6, Wolseley Hornet, 1932. The small 6-cylinder that promised more than its size could deliver. The Wolseley Hornet, a compact car powered by a genuine 6-cylinder engine rather than the 4-cylinder units typical of its class, was adopted by a handful of forces hoping to combine Wolseley's already well-established police reputation with genuine pace in a smaller, cheaper package than the marque's larger saloons. Its 1.3-liter overhead camshaft engine produced around 34 brake horsepower. Contemporary road tests recorded a top speed of around 65 miles per hour. The Hornet's 6-cylinder smoothness was a genuine selling point over the rougher 4-cylinder economy cars competing for the same fleet budgets, and Wolseley's name already carried real weight with police procurement officers by the early 1930s, a reputation the marque had begun building even before the decade started and would go on to dominate for another 30 years. That existing reputation was, in some ways, the Hornet's problem, since forces bought it expecting the same unimpeachable dependability as Wolseley's larger models. A Standard the smaller, more lightly built Hornet was never quite engineered to match. The unexpected fact, the Hornet's narrow, lightweight chassis, designed for economy motoring rather than police duty, struggled to carry the additional weight of radio equipment and a second occupant's kit at anything approaching its claimed top speed, meaning cars in genuine police trim rarely matched the figures the factory advertised in its brochures. The Hornet sold on a reputation the car itself, loaded and working, could not quite live up to, a gap between name and performance that would recur, in various forms, throughout this list. Number 5, Humber Snipe, 1930. Big, heavy, and reassuring right up until the moment it needed to turn a corner in a hurry. The Humber Snipe was adopted by several forces through the early 1930s as a larger, more substantial patrol and escort vehicle, valued for its size and presence rather than its outright pace, particularly for prisoner transport and duties where a smaller saloon would have looked, and felt, distinctly under-equipped. Its 3.5-liter 6-cylinder engine produced around 60 brake horsepower. Contemporary road tests recorded a top speed of around 70 miles per hour. The Snipe size made it a genuinely imposing presence on the road and gave it real capability for escort and prisoner transport duty that smaller saloons simply could not match, a car built to carry weight rather than to chase anything trying to outrun it. Humber's own advertising for the Snipe in this period leaned heavily on the car's presence and dignity, marketing language clearly aimed as much at the watch committees signing the purchase order as at the officers who would actually drive it. The unexpected fact, the Snipe's weight, well suited to straight-line stability, made it notably ponderous in corners by the standards of contemporary testers, and several forces reported the car requiring noticeably longer braking distances than the smaller saloons it was meant to complement, a genuine safety concern on the narrow, poorly surfaced roads that made up most of rural Britain at the time. A car bought for its presence turned out to need considerably more road than most British lanes of the period were willing to provide, and more than one force found that out the hard way. Number 4, Lanchester 15/18, 1935. The quietly expensive car nobody quite budgeted for. A small number of wealthier county forces adopted the Lanchester 1518 in the mid-1930s, drawn by the marque's reputation for engineering refinement inherited from its position within the Daimler Group, a pedigree that stretched back to some of the very earliest British motor cars. Its 1.8-liter six-cylinder engine produced around 50 brake horsepower. Contemporary road tests recorded a top speed of around 70 miles per hour. The 1518 offered genuinely smooth, well-engineered running, a level of refinement closer to Lanchester's larger luxury models than to the price it was actually sold at, and officers who drove it consistently rated its ride quality above almost anything else on this list. That refinement came from decades of engineering tradition rather than any deliberate effort to build a police car, and it showed in small ways, from a smoother clutch action to instrumentation clearly borrowed wholesale from Lanchester's private buyer models. The unexpected fact, Lanchester's absorption into the Daimler organization meant the 1518's production run and part supply were increasingly tied to decisions made about Daimler's own model range, and at least one force that ordered replacement cars later in the decade found its original supplier unable to guarantee continued part support. A bureaucratic complication no watch committee had anticipated when the original order went in. A car bought for its refinement ended up quietly hostage to a much larger company's priorities that had nothing to do with policing at all, and everything to do with a boardroom in Coventry deciding where Lanchester fit into Daimler's future. Number 3, Alvis Speed 20, 1932. The Q car that only the better-funded forces could actually afford. The Alvis Speed 20 became one of the favored unmarked pursuit cars, known within the era's slang as a Q car, used by the Metropolitan Police's plainclothes squads through the 1930s to chase suspects without announcing themselves in advance, a role that demanded genuine performance disguised inside entirely ordinary-looking coachwork. Its 2.5 to 3.5-liter six-cylinder engine produced up to around 106 brake horsepower in later specification. Contemporary road tests recorded a top speed of around 85 miles per hour. The Speed 20 gave plainclothes officers genuine pace and a chassis capable of hard cornering, a rare combination at a time when most marked patrol cars struggled past 60 miles per hour, and its reputation among the small number of officers who actually drove one remained strong for years afterward. Alvis had built its name on exactly this kind of fast, well-engineered touring chassis for private buyers, and the Speed 20 the Metropolitan Police bought was, in most meaningful respects, identical to the car a wealthy private motorist might have ordered from the same catalog. The unexpected fact, the Speed 20's purchase price put it comfortably beyond the reach of all but the wealthiest metropolitan forces, and the handful of provincial constabularies that expressed interest in the model are recorded abandoning the idea once the quoted cost reached committee, the figure alone enough to end the conversation before any test drive was arranged. A car built to catch anyone ended up catching only the interest of forces that could never actually afford to buy one, which meant its genuine capability benefited a single force in London while the rest of the country watched from a considerable distance. Number 2, Railton Straight 8, 1934. Britain's fastest road car of the period, and not entirely British at all. A small number of flying squad-style plainclothes units are reported to have trialed the Railton Straight 8 in the mid-1930s, drawn by its reputation as the quickest production car available in the country at the time, a reputation the Railton had earned largely by combining an imported engine with a chassis nobody else was building. Its 4.2-liter Straight 8 engine, based on an American Hudson unit fitted into a British chassis, produced around 113 brake horsepower. Contemporary road tests recorded a top speed of around 90 miles per hour, extraordinary for the period, and a figure that comfortably outran every other car on this list, sometimes by a margin of 20 miles an hour or more. The Railton's combination of American power and British coachwork made it genuinely the fastest thing available to any force willing to buy one, and its performance figures embarrassed cars costing considerably more, including several of the more expensive British-engined alternatives already in service elsewhere. That same hybrid construction, prized by the motoring press for delivering effortless power at a fraction of the cost of a genuinely bespoke British engine, made the car something of an outsider in a decade otherwise defined by buy-British sentiment among fleet purchasers. The unexpected fact, the Railton's American-sourced engine meant spare parts and specialist mechanical knowledge were considerably harder to source than for any genuinely British-built rival, a practical drawback that made the fastest car on this list also one of the hardest to actually keep running, particularly for a workshop more used to servicing Austins and Wolseleys. A car built to outrun anything on the road struggled, more than once, to simply get back to the station under its own power, an irony not lost on the officers who had to explain the delay. Number 1. Austin 7, 1930. Was slow. And here it is. Number 1. The car nobody remembers for being unreliable, because it never got fast enough to break down while chasing anything. The Austin 7, already established as Britain's best-selling small car by 1930, was adopted in large numbers by county and rural forces through the decade as the cheapest possible way to put a beat constable behind a wheel instead of on a bicycle, a straightforward economic decision repeated in watch committee minutes up and down the country. Its 747 cubic centimeters side valve engine produced around 10 brake horsepower. Contemporary road tests recorded a top speed of around 50 miles per hour, on a good road, going downhill, with a following wind, a figure that made it comfortably the slowest car on this entire list, including several the 7's own price undercut by half. The 7's tiny size and negligible running costs made it the only realistic option for forces whose entire annual transport budget could not have stretched to a single Humber Snipe, let alone anything faster, and for many rural constabularies it represented the first motor vehicle any of their officers had ever been issued. Herbert Austin had designed the 7 years earlier, as a car to put Britain on wheels rather than as anything approaching a performance vehicle, and that original brief never changed, whatever badge or paintwork a given force chose to add to it. The unexpected fact, several rural forces are recorded issuing internal guidance instructing constables not to attempt pursuit of any motor vehicle in an Austin 7, on the basis that almost any car built after 1925 could simply drive away from it without difficulty, a piece of guidance that effectively conceded, in writing, that the force's own patrol car could not do the one thing patrol cars exist to do. The 7 was never meant to catch anyone, and everybody who drove one for the police knew it. It was bought to be affordable, and affordable, in this particular case, meant a police car that had formally given up on the idea of pursuit before it had even left the factory, a limitation no amount of enthusiasm behind the wheel could ever fully overcome. That is the countdown. 10 cars, 1 decade, and a British police service working out, often by expensive trial and error, what a patrol car was actually supposed to do. Some forces bought for price and paid for it in workshop bills. Some bought for prestige and found the parts supply chain more fragile than the car. Some bought for speed and discovered speed was the one thing their budget could least afford to sustain. And at least one force, quite reasonably, simply told its own constables not to bother trying. Look at the 10 as a whole, and a pattern starts to form. The cheapest cars, the Standard and the Austin 7, were bought by committees answering to ratepayers who had never had to fund a motor fleet before, and every one of those decisions optimized for the invoice rather than the job it needed to do. The sporting cars, the Riley, the Alvis, the Railton, were bought by officers who understood exactly what a fast pursuit car needed to do, and every one of those decisions ran straight into a budget, a part shortage, or a workshop that simply couldn't keep pace with racing-bred engineering built for a very different kind of Sunday afternoon. Only a couple of cars on this list, the Wolseley and the Lanchester, tried to split the difference between economy and capability, and both ended up compromised in ways that satisfied nobody in particular. It's tempting, looking back from a century later, to laugh at some of these choices, the committee that bought a car built to be looked at rather than driven, the force that quietly returned its racing engine saloons within 2 years, the rural constabulary that formally instructed its own officers not to bother giving chase. But every one of those decisions was made by people doing something genuinely new, with no precedent to lean on and a public purse to answer to at every step. The Metropolitan Police had the budget and the case volume to justify an Alvis. A rural force covering 3 market towns and a stretch of coastline did not, and pretending otherwise would have wasted far more of the public's money than an Austin 7 ever did. The 1930s did not fail British policing through a lack of imagination. Wolseley, Riley, and Alvis all knew how to build a fast car, and any one of them could have built exactly what the job required, given the budget to do it properly. What the decade lacked, again and again, was the standardization, the sustained funding, or simply the plain good luck to put the right car in front of the right officer at the right moment, a problem that would not be properly solved until the Wolseleys of the following 2 decades finally settled into the role for good, purpose-built rather than borrowed from a private buyer's catalog. By the 1950s, a single marque could supply almost every force in the country with a car actually designed around what policing required. In the 1930s, that idea barely existed yet, and every car on this list, in its own way, is a record of what it cost to learn that lesson. Which of these 10 cars do you think deserved a better fate? Which one, if you'd been the constable behind the wheel, would you have least wanted to be sent out in? And be honest, would you have traded the Riley's speed for the Austin 12's reliability? Tell us below.